Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I am your co-host, Matt Alderman, joined by Mike Shima and John Kinsella. I'd like to welcome Sysdig as a new sponsor to Application Security Weekly. Sysdig's container intelligence platform is the first unified approach to monitor and secure containers across the entire software lifecycle. To learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/Sysdig. This is the last week for our 2019 Security Weekly 25 Index Survey. Please go to securityweekly.com and click the survey link to help us understand who's evaluating, using, or formerly used any of the Security Weekly 25 companies. The results will be summarized and presented back to all responders in a private webcast. And finally, we've heard from our listeners that they love our content, but the amount of content we distribute can sometimes be a little overwhelming. We've recently released our customizable listener interest list. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe and click the button to join the listener list and let us know your specific interests. We'll use this not only to help us fine-tune what topics to bring on the various shows, but also later this year, we'll start to connect those interest lists so that we can send you notifications when new content that you're interested comes out, therefore making it a little easier to consume. All right, gentlemen, let's hit the news. Mike, why don't you start with the Matrix?
The Matrix. Oh yeah. So we're going. So it's the year of 2019, of course, which means if you do the math, 20 years ago, on what was it, April 4th, I believe, The Matrix came out, and so one of the fun things about that, obviously, it was pretty big. Everybody liked to wear black after it. Awesome special effects. But there was also a funny, not so funny quote. Not sure exactly how to couch the funniness of it. But there's when Trinity and Neo first meet. Neo's like, the Trinity? The one who cracked the IRS DBase, which I guess is hacker slang for databases. Who knows? But he basically is like, oh, wait. I thought you were a guy. And Trinity just responds with that knowing nod that 20 years later, I think a lot of women in InfoSec kind of also recognize most guys usually think that.
Yep, very good quote. and dated ourselves just a little bit.
Just a little bit. It's also, as 2018, it's the year that Blade Runner is happening as well. So we've kind of like gone in some weird loop of pop culture, cyberpunk futures, I suppose, right now.
Yes. All right. You identified some bugs, and we have one breach to talk about. Why don't you and John can probably run us through the bugs. You guys know these things better than I do.
Sure. Well, there was one that was, I guess I'll dive into some bugs around Envoi. So Envoi is a cool open source tool that came out of Lyft. That's basically a way to create a service mesh, which basically just means a lot of different services can talk to each other very simply. So it's just a kind of an abstraction layer. The things that jumped out for me on this one in particular was that it had a directory traversal bug that was literally just a ... And it's just like if you're talking about the 90s or the early 2000s, like the old IIS double decode. And the other bug that got announced, also in a nice high CVSS score, was a null byte injection. So it's basically that %00 inside a URL. And what was interesting to me was a little bit just of that. I guess since we're kicked off our episode this week with a little bit of history, that here is Envoi, a tool being created by some very, very smart engineers from Lyft, from Google, a bunch of other areas. And it's just kind of an example that these very classic, very simple vulnerabilities keep getting reintroduced. And I think it's not necessarily because we don't know about it. I mean, we've had, 20 years of application security awareness, at least 20 years of people writing books and giving presentations, and yet mistakes happen and people are still fallible. And anytime you have something where you're dealing with URLs, make sure you're doing a proper parsing of them. So you're actually dealing with them rather than with regexes and trying to pattern match within them. And make sure you get your canonicalization and your parsing and your authorization checks in the right order. So you know that you're turning that %00 into a null character, not necessarily a string terminated null, that your dot dot slash isn't going outside your directory root, and so on. So that's one of the areas of that I thought was pretty cool to talk about. I'm not sure, John, if there's a different angle or something else around Envoy, if you're familiar with that one in particular, that
It
you
was
thought.
interesting. I saw these when they came out last week. There was, I think you've got two. I think there was more. There was a few of these came out. I think it's on the open security list. But yeah, these aren't. I don't want to call them low hanging fruit, but I think in a lot of ways we've seen developers become more sophisticated and more aware of what's going on over the last decade or two. But at the same time, these are I think people get a little more interested and focused on, protecting against SQLi and the more sort of the sexy things. But still, yeah, you got to be looking for the basics. And this, it's not like these are coming from a small development team, right? This is from Lyft. These guys, they've done some good code and they've open sourced a lot of good stuff. But still, it got to run stuff through some sort of a scanner tool or something to help you find some of these easy bugs, because even on a human code review, these can be sort of hard to miss if you're not watching closely.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons I kind of wanted to highlight it too, is sort of that idea that people are still making mistakes, and it's not to beat up on the developers. It's just to be like, our focus shifts over time, and we think, the SQL injection or cross-site scripting is going to be eternal, or there's more nuanced authorization types of problems. But yeah, you got to deal with the basics. Another kind of thing, I guess I'm going to use that as a segue. There was also another interesting thing I came across, which was I try to avoid the named attacks as much as possible, but this one was called a selfie attack. So I guess millennials are killing TLS 1.3 if we want to make our jokes. But this was in TLS 1.3 had a attack that was called Selfie, that was essentially a way of if they're using if they're trying to establish a session key using a pre-shared key, so sort of an out-of-band agreement to mutually authenticate each other, then it was a way to basically create that mutual authentication to completely break down. Now, that doesn't mean, by no means does that mean that TLS 1.3, the sky is falling or it's broken. This is probably even kind of a really sort of weird corner case of why is this type of pre-shared key capability in TLS 1.3. So again, I think I wanted to call this one out as sort of a, why can't we just also throw away a lot of stuff we're not using and really not worry as much as possible about backwards compatibility, especially if we're trying to do things in a lot of very sensitive crypto areas. Let's make it a lot simpler, and that way we don't even have to deal with vulnerabilities, even if they may not be super impactful, sky is falling. Again, people are making mistakes in crypto.
Yeah, but isn't the challenge, though, is with needing to be backwards compatible, it makes for an easy upgrade path without a lot of retesting. And isn't that the reason why we embed some of this old stuff that we may not be using or shouldn't be using into these libraries into the future?
Yeah, it's definitely the tough one. So there's that classic case of, how many IE6 browsers are still out there that we want to support. I'm going to try to take it from the opposite end of the spectrum. We've seen like the browser vendors, especially Chrome, for example, really driving forward and saying, we're going to start deprecating SHA-1 certs. We're going to start, we're going to make your search results impacted by your TLS configuration. Are you HTTPS or not? So I think there's some larger ecosystem participants that are also driving this. So it's hard to say backwards compatibility can just be, snap our fingers, we don't have to worry about it. But if we have an ecosystem that's doing a couple basic things, meaning auto updates tend to be more often than not. They're also turned on by default, hopefully. And we've also seen like operating system updates are essentially free. Software updates are essentially free. So we're moving the cost of security, or call it like security behaviors, or doing proper like hygiene, if you will, for your software. There's no longer, financial costs associated with it. It's more behavioral costs. And I think over time, as we've seen things like we've got mobile devices that tend to have much better upgrade paths than old school desktops. So that's going to be my argument for why we should still try to push forward with being more optimistic and more aggressive on not worrying as much about backwards compatibility without forgetting that, not everybody can afford the latest and greatest iPhone. So there are other compelling reasons why we need to make sure we don't just cut everybody out as we, move forward with these technologies.
Yep, I know, I get
And
it.
this was
It's the business challenge of upgrades and just the testing and all the things that go into that, which is why I think we do it as more of a habit than it is anything else.
Yeah, John, do you want to
sort of
Facebook's back
looking
in the
at
news.
this from wait, I missed the Facebook one really quickly on this. So there's two interesting things about this to me. One is, I mean, just compared to the Envoy ones we were just talking about, which we'd call, like I said, almost low-hanging fruit, not really. But now we're looking at this. This is really sophisticated, actually. I mean, if you look at the TLS protocols, these have been around for a while. People are always banging on because there's so much money being made out of if someone can actually break these protocols or break how they're being used. So they're getting a ton of eyes on them from, probably governments and everything else. And still we're able to find weaknesses in them, right? And then every time I see a vulnerability announcement come out, one of the things I look at is who found it. So the first thing interesting on this, when we look around, we're just seeing a BibTech from a paper release, right? So this is actually going through an academic release process versus, like, even though it has a name, usually you have your own website, like, some vendor tied to it. But this one's actually going through from an academic point of view between someone at a researcher at a university, I believe in Israel, along with someone at Amazon. So interesting to see who's looking at these things and what they're able to find.
Yeah, that's a great point because it's the idea that those Envoy bugs hopefully should have been shallow. For example, shallow bugs, many people could understand them, but the nuances of crypto, there's just having that open source is great, but just, I guess, reinforcing your point, the type of people and the skills needed, I guess I should say, to be able to find those are fewer and far between.
Yeah, so Facebook's back in the news, some more user accounts breached, but this was from Facebook's application developers, not from Facebook directly.
Not from Facebook directly, yeah. So here is a way let's not always throw Facebook under the bus. I wanted to use this as more of that discussion of you are a company, you present a service, you provide data. How do you make sure your app developers, your not your end user consumers, but your developer ecosystem are using your app in a good way? And I think even in this case, perhaps it may have been a little bit more exaggerated than possible because I think the public data was actually like likes and public comments rather than internal leaks. And there were some passwords leaked as well, but there was only, I think, roughly 22,000 passwords for a particular app. So they weren't actually Facebook passwords. But it's still a great headline in the sense of here is the reputational explosion around Facebook that says, here's how we're trying some constraints we've tried to put on our data. Here's what developer access has, and there's that far end of the spectrum like Cambridge Analytica, and then this end where it's just somebody essentially scraping publicly available Facebook data and aggregating it, and it's that aggregated data that potentially has a lot of value to people for very different reasons, as well as a lot of potential liability just to say, hey, look, you presented this all, you as Facebook presented this all, it was collected, and now there's misuse of it.
Yeah, it's part of that supply. It's part of that vendor relationship in some respects, right? I mean, it's not Facebook directly, but it's their data through another source, which happens to be developing an application on top of Facebook in this particular case.
Yeah, exactly.
Very interesting. Yeah. Let's talk Windows containers, Dockers, and Docker and Kubernetes, right? Some improvements there. We know, John and I are very familiar with the relationship that Docker and Microsoft have had over the past few years as we work together at Layered Insight. Looks like more improvements with Windows containers and Docker and Kubernetes here.
Yeah, I think this is really cool. It's funny. I actually, when we were down at Information Security World last week, I had one or two people asking me, and it's something I hadn't thought about yet, but how do we do Active Directory with containers? And I'm like, I was trying to add, okay, well, how do you mean? Are you talking about authenticating the application in a container, or having that application use your authentication? Or, and I think, this article sort of really helps, really responds to that question. It's like, how do you think about RBAC for who's going to run containers, and what's going to happen with that in a Kubernetes environment? And the Kube guys have already been doing that on the Linux side. There's the RBAC system has been coming along in leaps and bounds over the last year or two. But now being able to do this with a really an enterprise grade system like Windows, I think that's going to help a ton of folks.
Yeah, and addresses some of the issues and concerns with authentication and who has access to do what with containers. Are we seeing a big adoption of Windows containers? John and Mike, have you guys seen activity there?
For me, it's slow. It's growing, but it's still slow. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
not really.
Look,
on my radar.
we know Azure's growing. It's been successful moving more of their enterprise accounts into Azure, but are they really using Windows containers as part of their digital transformation efforts? Or are they still just using more on the Linux container side? I'm always curious that growth.
It's so, how would I say? It's so just such the massive amount of the market is on the Linux side that when we hear use of Windows, even in a non-containerized environment, I've got a customer right now who's got their Jenkins masters installed on a Windows server. I'm like, what? Never in a million years would have thought of that before, but hey, it works. So, and that's on the container side, we're starting to see it as the larger enterprises are starting to adopt this stuff. And they're looking at how did they get their .NET apps in there. Red Hat and those guys had a pretty good run for a year or two with .NET Core, but Microsoft is full steam ahead on this stuff.
Interesting. Mike, nothing there?
No, nothing. Yeah, it's just not popping up in the areas that I'm working in.
Got it. This next article is interesting. And you and I think, agree on this one. We kind of tend to disagree. How to design DevSecOps compliance processes to free up developer resources. It's almost stated the wrong way if we think about it a little bit. It's an interesting article where I think we see the opposite, right? Is that DevOps is changing the way we have to think about compliance and security, not really compliance changing the way we think about DevOps per se.
Yeah, I think I definitely, without being overly negative, I tend to see security not having influenced development that much, and that DevOps basically saying, we're going to write some code faster and we're going to adopt whatever we want to call it, agile, we want to call it something else. But here's our CI/CD pipeline. Hey, security, do you want to come in and take a look at this? And that is sort of how I see DevOps is radically changing security, and in that case, I think in a better way. And then some of the things Netflix, for example, since they dove in already at the very beginning to be we want to be AWS in the cloud. They had some really, strong engineering principles around that. They had that chaos monkey approach, and their chaos monkey predated their security monkey. And I just that's maybe just a little bit of trivia, but I saw that in the sense of, here's an engineering problem. We want to go dive into it. And by the way, security, you have to actually catch up and make sure that, systems go down, they can come up, but that they can also be properly authenticated, identity is strong, authorization is strong, and things like that. And so these DevSecOps, or just even DevOps principles, I think are the ways that are pulling security in to make it easier on developers actually, because I guess the other thing I want to shout out there is that why don't we bring security to where the developers are? If they're working in that CI/CD pipeline, they've got some touch points. Great. Now let's put our Falco into the container rather than making it do something really extra add-on or special that's difficult for the developers to do.
Yeah, so this was my whole talk at InfoSec World at the DevSecOps Symposium, which is DevOps has already defined the process. Security and compliance. Sorry, guys, you're not defining the process. The DevOps teams have defined the process. So if you want to effectively address security and compliance, you have to figure out where you fit into their existing process. And this was this unifying discussion that I presented last Saturday, which is where are those checkpoints? Where do you do source code analysis as part of the check-in and the build process? Where do you do things like vulnerability and compliance checks as part of binary checks before that stuff goes to the orchestrators? Where do you put other runtime security components, whether it's in the container or as part of the Kubernetes cluster? That's what I think we really need to be focused on. And that is security really figuring out how they fit into the existing process. I don't think compliance or security can dictate, per se, what the DevOps process looks like.
Yep.
So this is
thumbs up for
it's
me.
funny because I was covering this a little bit in my keynote down at InfoSec World last week too. And recently my thought has changed a little bit on this from the point of view of I want the security team to go out and really engage with the rest of the development and the rest of the ops teams. I don't want those fences between these groups, right? And to the degree where I started thinking about it is, I think this is a wonderful chance for a security team to start slowly cooking the frog, to use that phrase. So from the point of view of, if we went back 5 years ago and said, hey, we'd like you dev guys or the ops teams to start, adding in, any of these things we've been talking about, something like Sysdig or something like, Grafana into your source code so we'd start getting more metrics, or the ability to have a WAF compiled in, or all these sort of different things, you would have been laughed out of the room, not a chance. But now you've got the developers coming to us and saying, hey, we're really excited about using containers. We're really excited about serverless. We want to use all these cool things. It's a perfect chance to start, really sort of baking the security tools in there and getting to be able to take data from what those guys are using and start doing correlation and look for patterns and detection. And it's, I don't know, I think it's a really great chance for in a more legacy companies, but particularly where they're just still getting their foot into this DevOps thing. So I'm holding out a lot of hope.
I agree. The opportunity's definitely there. It's who's driving it, and I think it's DevOps working closely with security that makes it happen. And security's got to be open and willing to understand the pipeline and understand where they integrate. I don't think security can dictate to DevOps, and I think that's the mistake a lot of security professionals are taking right now. It's more collaborative.
Yeah, it's absolutely got to be collaborative, like everyone's saying. And a cool thing that I'd add there is maybe one of the reasons that developers is being easier to adopt is so much of these abstraction layers are actually getting turned into config files. So now you just can essentially lint through some text config files, the YAML or whatever else you want it to be, and it's a lot easier to reason through and tie these pieces together. So I think that's also just a helpful thing, both from the security side as well, just be able to say, what does our network look like? And it's a little bit easier to, visualize mentally, build a mental model based on some relationships between config files and your containers and how they interact with each other. Drop in some key management, drop in some strong identities between services, and you have a compelling story that you can actually write out as some code that, rather than spinning up systems manually, walking through data centers, racking systems, things like that.
Yep, agreed. Mike, you want to cover your ARM assembler?
Yeah, so this one, this one looks really cool, and I'm not going to give it justice at the moment because I haven't had time to play with this. But this is from Azaria Labs, has created basically an in-browser ARM assembler. So for those of you who have gotten out of web application security and want to dive back into actual code and 32-bit flags and things like writing in assembly, so to speak, you can do so from the comfort of your browser. And I think it's really neat for a couple reasons. One, it's eminently accessible. Load up the browser. It's a very well-written design, and user interface. So kudos to that, to just the user experience, because that's one of the things that often engineers and security tools don't really have good usability design. But the other thing too, to be a little bit more forward-looking, understanding ARM, I think, is a great knowledge to have and skill because it's not going away in the sense of IoT devices. Who knows if the Apple ecosystem is going to come back to ARM? There's other companies that have said they wanted to switch their servers from in using ARM's processors. So having these low-level knowledge and capabilities, I think is just a great thing to have within your security tool belt. And what I will say here is maybe put an asterisk on this, and then we can maybe try to get Azeri to come on, walk us through a couple areas of highlights and how we could really take advantage of a tool like this.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, no, it brought back lots of memories. I've been getting into the ARM space. I haven't touched the assembly side yet, but yeah, I've got this in the tab and I can't wait to play with it.
Good. Now, the last three articles all kind of relate to each other a little bit, right? And that is security testing trends for 2019, containers are still the weakest link, and application security in a serverless world, right? I don't think we need to talk about them independently because the three of us, I think we see where the market's going when it comes to AppSec and all the challenges we have and thinking about what that evolution for the industry will mean. So I think we can probably cover all three of these in one discussion.
Which one do you want to dig into first?
I think in general, I mean,
Okay.
if we think about the world from an application security perspective, the old way was we had one big piece of code, we'd throw it on a server and we would run it. That doesn't exist anymore, right?
Yeah.
We've started to break up the app and distribute it into microservices leveraging containers. So containers create a new challenge by themselves. But then we're deploying these containers in not a single server, maybe not even a dedicated server, because now I can run this as a platform as a service, basically, is in ECS or EKS or even in Fargate as we move. And that impacts a lot of different aspects of application security, I think, in general.
Yeah, I think because we were kind of in the interview earlier, we actually alluding to this, what does the serverless future look like for us? How much can we see into it? How much, instrumentation do we get there? And there's still, I think, some classic problems that we'd still be dealing with, and such as your third-party libraries. Just what is, your developers are writing some custom code to build up your, microservice to do to do a very specific dedicated function, but it's also pulling in a bunch of third-party RPMs or NPMs or packages if you're gems and pip, what have you. And I'd made a note here that just kind of topically, there was a Bootstrap SaaS Ruby gem that had a backdoor in it that I think the backdoor was detected it was introduced at the end of March, and I think it was announced either that week or just last week. So not necessarily, it was supposedly downloaded 28 million times. Those numbers don't necessarily mean how many people were potentially infected where it was used. But I guess the roundabout way, my point I'm making here is, it doesn't matter if we're server or serverless, it's the code that we're running that we have to care about. And whether we're trying to have those secure coding to get rid of those, directory traversals or, crypto mistakes, there's also all the other code that everyone else wrote that we don't know about or we haven't audited, or at very least, we just want to know, is that running on my system? So just being able to say, hey, is this Ruby gem on my system? And then is this version specifically on my system? Being able to answer that question with confidence and quickly is a great security win. And I think that we have some tooling to be able to do that, but getting that tooling and having that CI/CD pipeline be instrumented in that way so that you actually have something as simple to say, but as difficult to do as a app inventory or your dependency graph, that's going to be a problem that no one has solved in a very good way yet, regardless of the direction of where this AppSec capabilities are going.
Yeah, I mean, inventory in general was hard in the days of hardware and third-party software, let alone custom software, to your point, right? We have all these embedded libraries and binaries that we're using to build our custom code. and we don't necessarily understand the downstream impacts of the vulnerabilities sitting in those. And so that dependency graph is I think, pretty huge when we think about a single application and potentially all the distributed components and all the distributed libraries that make up those components. Really challenging.
That is. And I think too, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think it was about 5 or 8 years ago when someone started, I think it was on a panel, and someone asked me this question about supply chain management, and it was a cloud security panel. Like, supply chain management, that's something that, like, the ERP guys do with the warehouse. It took me a while to actually get my head around it. And I think that's really sort of a core portion of what's going on here again, is as these applications become more and more complex, even within your own build cycle, even if it's just within your own data center, right? Like, how do you know at every single step of the way that, something hasn't been introduced? So I think it's quite difficult to do. There's some tools there to help with it now from, a signature point of view and validation, but there's still a long way to go. So here at, public company doing security, when we come out with a new product, one of the things we have to go through from a legal point of view is, okay, what open source packages were used, what licenses were on them. And in some languages, that's super simple, right? I've gone through for Go. We were talking about Ruby here and the JavaScript stuff with NPMs. You go back and look at that in some of the compiled languages like a C or C++, becomes a little more difficult to actually track down that include you've got. Is that from an open source package? Okay, where did that come from? So it's still, takes a lot of work in some cases, presuming you have the source.
True. And I know I met with one of the Fed guys down at InfoSec World last week. I think he left before you got there, John, but they're talking about the software bill of materials, right? Back to the supply chain piece. What is the bill of materials when you build a software package? They're trying to build some standards around it to make it clearer of what are all the things that are embedded in a piece of code, because this is the world we're moving to, where we are reusing a lot of components and we don't necessarily understand what all those components are. Actually, we should probably try to bring them on the show and at some point talk about the whole challenge and concern around the software bill of materials, because I think it's an interesting topic that all of us have to kind of get our arms around as we're building this code.
Yeah, I've quoted way too many times Steve, the CEO over at Docker, talking about additive collaboration. Just looking at containers you get off Docker Hub, right? Docker pull, and next thing you've got there's your database. But okay, what was that the legitimate one? Is it patched? Is it up to date? And it can take a lot of work to actually keep track of all that. And that's just at the one time, not alone after it's been running for a week or a month.
Right. That's true. Mike, back to the similar concept, right? I mean, obviously inventory and the third-party supply chain. But what are you seeing also as we move to more containers? What shifts do you have to do with some of your tooling in the types of checks that you're doing?
Yeah, so it's the idea that even if we never had like that app inventory under control, we also don't want to lose control over new stuff. So the tooling needs to, I guess there's a couple ways I look at it. One, the tooling, you always want to have visibility, just what is going on. One of the things that like was the idea of like serverless or really short-lived containers is that you can just spin them up and they last for a few minutes, they do their job and then they go down. But if that one had to be compromised, do you have any indicator of that? Because it's not so much the worry about hackers are getting root on our systems. It's more about what data have they exfiltrated, or what credentials have they stolen or compromised that they can reuse, or what are their secrets. So there always has to be that visibility. We're just kind of shifting or figuring out where and how to put that visibility into it. And does it come from the clouds, the cloud provider's tooling? Does it have to come from some open source capabilities that we layer on top, commercial tools, and so on? The other thing, I guess, as we're talking about changing tooling and how to react to it, is that idea of identity still and trust is still being worked through in reliable ways. So early on in the cloud, everybody was realizing that, oops, we can't really track things by IP address and by host name, because IPs change all the time by design now, and IP addresses are no longer like a a solid identifier, because who knows what was running on that on Monday might be something different running on Tuesday. So tying this crypto to identities, whether or not, we actually have a well done PKI story in this day and age. PKI dates back, well over 20 years as a concept. Maybe now we're getting to the point where we can actually deploy it well and have tooling that says that's be able to build a service that can build itself, establish some trust that says the source code that I was given, this binary blob that I created at the end, matches that source code. There was nothing in the supply chain that was maliciously changed or modified along the way. And now that I can attest that I am built without tampering, this is my identity to go forth and talk to other services. And those other services can trust I'm who I say I am, and then they'll open up and say, yes, you can have access to this data, you can have access to this service, you can you're authorized to do, these next steps. So that might sound perhaps a little bit high level, but I think, the principles of that is where I see a lot of the tooling, or I guess the engineering, maybe to use the stronger term, have to go in that direction.
So that reminds me of I was going to say really quickly, it reminds me of that's the application security version of .1Q tagging on a network switch, right? And so that's been around again for at least the mid-90s, if not earlier. And almost nobody was using .1Q on a switch. So for those who don't know, .1Q allows you to say before your laptop, when you plug it in, before that actually has any access on the network, you have to go through and authenticate to some sort of server or whatever's necessary, jump through the hoops to say, I'm somebody, then you get permissions and you get added to a VLAN. It's slowly starting to get added now as we've got endpoint services starting to come on and be more common over the last, call it 5 years. But hopefully that'll happen a little bit quicker on the AppSec side, because I think that's a really the great way to go with a service mesh or something.
Interesting. Networking concepts coming into application provides some value, but not always the old techniques and tools work, though. So some concepts can be reapplied.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, gentlemen. Anything else? That was my list of news for the week.
You exhausted my list. It was a pretty good conversation, so I had some fun talking about it.
Yeah, and this is only our first session together. We only have more. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.